Chapter 25. Zera, Omodera. Gloria and Kellogg had been waiting in the Billy Graham Hospitality Lounge in the Legends of Heaven building for over an hour. They'd been summoned by Everhart, but he had more pressing business first. Lately, there'd been an erosion in his deference to their judgment. He was starting to take control. So they waited. They'd come to the realization they'd created a Frankenstein, and now they were worried about its behavior. Out of public view, Everhart had taken to occasionally dressing in flowing white robes, sometimes sitting for hours silently staring out over the bays. On occasion, he'd repeat unintelligible mantras in an endless loop. There was no thought of the vice president stepping in. As a figurehead, he was completely unacceptable. He was a mousy, reserved man who lacked the savoir-faire necessary to induce the desired public idolatry. So, despite the president's behavior, keeping the main thing was the main thing. As between the two of them, Glory was decidedly less enthusiastic about the proposed way forward than was Kellogg. Glory would rather stick to the tried and true methods of wielding power: indoctrination, tradition, hope, and fear. These were the instruments that won the hearts and minds of men. He didn't need to go to war to establish his objectives. The only army he needed was the Keepers. Given enough time, he could establish orders of the Guardian Keep garrisons anywhere in the world. Their command of local armies and militias would be sufficient to establish trade and maintain order. Given enough resources, he could persuade most situations without resorting to violence at all. He didn't see the wisdom in all-out warfare. On the other hand, Kellogg's arguments had been the most persuasive with the cartel. Islam needed to be dealt with. But while Kellogg wanted more commitments from European allies, Everhart, who cryptically referenced the power of the Ark of the Covenant, wasn't averse to unilateral action. World domination notwithstanding, they were most anxious to suppress evidence of Everhart's increasingly emergent Messiah complex. Lately, he'd taken to closing his remarks with the benediction, "I hear your prayers." The senior advisors were loath to keep such phrases out of the public discourse. The problem was, neither man knew how best to broach the subject. They never knew anymore how Everhart would react. Inasmuch as his demeanor differed drastically from one persona to the next, it was a toss-up as to who showed up at any given moment. While his advisors waited, Everhart prepared for his next appointment. Presently, he heard the familiar whirring of the elevator as the floor slid back, and Dr. Zera Omodera stepped crisply off the lift. Dr. Omodera was Everhart's strikingly attractive, incredibly capable senior advisor, and the only black on his staff. She was also the head of the Evangelical Church of the Congo. The Congo Church had long been a proponent of U.S. administrative policy in Africa, and Everhart intended to keep it that way. Dr. Omodera's late husband had been the previous head of the synod, and when he died, she'd been approved to succeed him. Everhart had likewise inherited her. They'd first met in Arlington, Virginia, at a place called the Cedars. The Cedars is a mansion owned by a powerful C Street fellowship with the ironic nickname of the Family. It's a place where heads of state and prominent politicians meet to discuss how they can best be of mutual benefit. The Congo Christians numbered over 63 million, and Everhart saw them as a strategic as well as enriching asset. Their entire value was reflected in Dr. Omodera's comportment. She was stately, sanguine, and disarming. Her fealty was crucial to Everhart's plans. When the war came, he intended to use her sub-Saharan Christians to counterbalance the North African Muslims. The undertaking to establish the Congo Church stretched back to 1909. It was just after the end of the reign of King Leopold II when Swiss missionaries first arrived. The newly named Belgian Congo had theretofore been known as the Congo Free State. In the late 1800s, at a symposium known as the Berlin Conference, European powers had given the Congo Basin to a private concern run by Leopold II of Belgium. The territory, under Leopold's control, exceeded 1 million square miles. Yet, rather than control the Congo as a colony, Leopold solely owned his property outright. These were his very own personal niggers, and he did whatever he wanted to with them, and he answered to no one. Between 1891 and 1906, he forced the entire population into slave labor. To impose his will, Leopold formed a private paramilitary group of black turncoats called the Force Publique. The force recruited mercenaries from as far away as Liberia and Zanzibar. Chief among the recruits were the dreaded Zappo-Zaps, the most feared tribe in the Congo. They merited the title because the Zappo-Zaps were cannibals. Leopold understood that nothing so concentrated the mind as the prospect of becoming lunch. After Leopold died, Finnish and Swedish missionaries also swooped into the area. Together with the Swiss, they persuaded the natives to accept the doctrines that would eventually transform their primitive wasteland from a backward culture of the past into a backward culture of the future. A culture whose natural resources would be fully utilized in the service of the Lord. Dr. Omodera had been indispensable in promoting the agenda of the United Congregations of Christland in the World Communion of Reformed Churches. However, none of the churches had a clue as to Everhart's real intentions. In his deepening psychosis, Everhart saw the world as being under the authority of a single theocracy, a theocracy he would lead as First Lord Supreme of the divine realm of Christ. He saw himself as the ruler of heaven on earth. In this world over, the sole purpose of Africans would be to serve whites. Under his administration, the gigantic mineral-rich landmass of Africa would be transformed into the industrial agricultural breadbasket of the world. He expected resistance. He looked forward to it. He'd make Leopold look like a pauper. This philosophy didn't extend to Dr. Omodera, of course. She was different. She was someone upon whose personal services he could depend. As she approached, he rose from his chair and deftly unbuckled his belt. "Good morning, Dr. Omodera," he said while unceremoniously unzipping his pants.
Good morning, Mr. President.
She answered as his trousers slid to the floor. Dr. Omodera came behind the desk as Everhart lowered his boxers. Dropping to her knees, she brushed the curls of her thick hair from her eyes and opened the desk's lower drawer. Reaching inside, she slid aside a false bottom and retrieved a small blue velvet box. She opened it, pulled out a custom-made glass hypodermic needle, and stood up. Edric turned his back and leaned over the desk. Dr. Omodera filled a syringe with a clear liquid drawn from a small vial she pulled from her bag. Cupping a pink butt cheek in a smooth mahogany hand, she pushed the needle into the tissue, slowly injecting the substance. After a moment, Everhart's head dipped slowly downward. His eyes fluttered and closed as a warm euphoria crept leisurely through his body. Eventually, Dr. Omodera's voice floated in his ear.
How is the wellness bill coming along?
Almost done. Crafting the language. Should be introduced next week. He pulled his pants up and flopped back in his chair. Despite its name, the wellness bill was actually deregulation legislation intended to relax restrictions on designer drugs. Dr. Omodera put the blue velvet box back in its place. Everhart smiled his approval as she shook her hair once more.
Will that be all, sir?
Yes, thank you. I don't know what I'd do without you.
Nonsense. It's just a little pick-me-up. You're a busy man.
And then, like switching on a light, Everhart popped to. His composure firmly intact, he asked the nonplussed Dr. Omodera to please call Glory, tell him to come up. On the way to the upper room, a disgruntled Kellogg visibly winced at the idea of Dr. Omodera. Nothing was more antithetical to his universe than a black woman with political influence. The more Glory apologized for her, the more upset Kellogg got. Even when Glory coaxed, "Be realistic. Who can communicate with Africans better than she can? She speaks English, French, Lingala, Swahili.
She's respected. She's a doctor, after all.
None of which mattered to Kellogg.
The day I need a nigger bitch to help me keep other niggas in line is the day I hang myself.
Everhart was adjusting his tie when the cabinet members stepped off the lift. By way of greeting, he asked, "How are the oil reserves looking?" Gloria instinctively deferred to Kellogg.
We need to secure the California coast and develop the Arctic possibilities before we can go full steam.
And what's the time frame?
Well, that's kind of up to you, sir.
If I greenlight you right now.
From an oil point of view, sir?
Is there another?
No disrespect, sir. Lots of moving parts, lots of logistics to consider. The oil is the main thing, but...
Bullshit! Oil's the whole thing. There are no moving parts without it. Glory felt Everhart was moving too fast. He'd begun insisting on his own agenda over the plans of his erstwhile puppet masters. In an attempt to slow Everhart down, Glory had convinced the president that as legal counsel, Boatwright should attend the meeting. Glory knew Everhart wasn't a fan and only abided Boatwright because of Glory's insistence. Everhart, however, would only allow Boatwright to participate in the meeting via video monitor. Boatwright's legal mind served Everhart well when used in the service of his legislative machinations, but his opposition arguments had cost him the president's favor. Yet, the true nature of Everhart's displeasure with Boatwright stemmed from Boatwright's refusal to placate his God complex. Everhart suddenly contended. The first thing the Russians will do is start exploration of the Lomonosov Ridge. The rights to the continental crust in the Arctic Ocean were in dispute, and Boatwright interjected. That's going to create a problem with the Canadians. The Canadians won't interfere. How can you be sure? Kellogg wasn't about to let some button-down ambulance chaser interfere with its plans.
Let the Canadians try. What they gonna do? They got no real army, and I'm certainly not gonna help them fight the Russians. Meanwhile, we got Kanoko, BP, and the rest, pledging their Alaskan well. What's all the fuss? Dissolve the reserves and get down to business.
Because he'd been kept out of the loop, Boatwright wasn't sure what he was listening to. From a primal standpoint, he understood Kellogg's bloodlust. Apart from his genuine empathy for Everhart's Muslim position, Kellogg was, at his core, a quintessential guts and glory warrior. Any excuse for a war was good enough for him. But that didn't explain everything. He was a wild hare, but he wasn't a fool. Neither was Glory. But not being privy to the arcane society's motives, Boatwright didn't understand why these guys were going along with Everhart's nonsense. The administration's immediate game plan was simple. First, through apparent war games, they'd position the Navy to blockade the Gulf. Operatives would then launch a missile offensive against Tel Aviv from inside the Golan Heights. The mission objective would be to cause maximum human casualties in order to create the greatest outrage. Initially, no group would take credit for the attack, but soon, Allied intel would discover an Islamic Jihad cell to be responsible. Boatwright knew the Israelis would strike the heights long before any intel reports came back. He questioned how they'd be dissuaded from retaliating against innocent people.
You're kidding. Nothing's gonna stop them.
And that's okay.
Omelets, eggs. But don't worry. We'll turn their attention to Tehran soon enough.
Frame Tehran.
Jesus, man, are you listening?
Kellogg explained that once Israel got a hold of the fake intelligence reports, they'd go after Tehran, and the UCC would back them. When told of a preemptive black ops blitz on Hezbollah, Hamas, and PIJ cells in advance of the Tehran strike, Boatwright wondered if he wasn't the victim of an executive-level prank.
You're not thinking of striking inside Lebanon. Wherever they're at, Sonny. Wherever they're at.
And when it's learned that Tehran didn't actually attack Tel Aviv?
Whose side are you on, son? Whose side are you on?
We can't kill all the Muslims in existence, you know. No matter what we do, there'll always be Muslims. We could end up in a worse situation than we have now. That's when Everhart casually revealed that he'd recently received a visitation from the spirit of the Chinese god Tianzi. According to Everhart, he'd had a vision wherein Tianzi had challenged him for the spiritual supremacy of the world. He went on to say that a great battle had ensued between the hosts of good and the hordes of evil, and that he'd almost died in the struggle. At the height of the battle, the yellow deity had finally succeeded in dividing Yahweh's armies. He had them on the brink of defeat, and just as he was about to deliver the death blow, a multitude of angels suddenly arrived from the west and by righteousness brought an end to the conflict. With the battle at an impasse, Tianzu consented to Everhart's having supreme spiritual reign over the west, while Tianzu would have dominion over Allah and the whole of Asia. The muffled confusion that followed prompted Everhart to clarify. Until such time as Jesus returns, I will stand in his earthly stead. I have been granted every authority over all those who prostrate themselves before Mecca. Those Muslims who come under my authority will be bound over to Tianzu, who well understands how to deal with them. Nobody knew what to say, and in an effort to return the conversation to a semblance of sanity, Boatwright overtly ignored the declaration by asking,
Who fills the vacuum when Tehran falls?
The Saudis. With Tehran out of the way, Riyadh instantly becomes the center of Islamic power.
Why would the faithful follow the edicts of the Saudi royal family rather than the imam?
Imams, shimams. When the faithful's bellies get empty, they'll follow the Saudis to the table. In the end, they'll worship their bellies above all. And the better for me, because the Saudis don't have the bomb.
Game it out. What about the Egyptian Coptics and other Christians in the area?
What about them?
Local Arab governments will put extreme pressure on the Christians. If that happens, Christians here at home will want revenge. Are we going to take sides with the Muslims against the Christians?
Hell, man, they're just sand niggers. A lot of our local niggers here call themselves Christians, too. We treat them like shit, don't we? You don't hear any hue and cry on their behalf, do you? But as far as the foreign Christians, we'll ransom them out, pay the Arabs to carve out some autonomous territory somewhere. But no matter what happens, the dark Christians will stay where they are. As far as I'm concerned, Syrians, Libyans, Coptics, Jews, whatever, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, whether they're Uyghurs or taking niggers, every tongue will confess me. Everhart looked to Kellogg for confirmation and quickly got it. But Galori merely smiled benevolently and lowered his head. Suddenly, Everhart asked Galori,
Who do people say that I am?
The question stung. Galori knew what was coming next. Still, he gave the expected answer by quoting Mark 8:27.
Some say Elijah, some say, Who do you say I am?
Just as he feared. Galori had always been evasive concerning his benefactor's allusions to omnipotence. He'd merely been conciliatory to the extent that he'd smile and nod whenever Everhart referenced his deity. But now he'd been asked point blank whether he agreed with Everhart's claims of divinity. Galori knew that any answer short of complete fealty would be disastrous. Everhart's behavior may have been aberrant, but he had the survival instincts of a medieval monarch. Never mind that Galori had helped him rise to the pinnacle of political power. The mere suspicion of disloyalty would be his end. As Everhart's gaze burrowed deeper into his head, Galori rifled the pages of his vast diplomatic manual. This time, his usually eloquent tongue abandoned him. Realizing that further hesitation would be construed as dithering, Galori heard himself say,
God.